Do you think you already understand the children of King Edward VII? Because he was not only the ruler of a vast empire, he was also a father, raising his children at the very center of power. One child was destined to wear the crown. Another left England and became the Queen of Norway. Another stayed in the palace to care for their mother. And one child lived only long enough to feel the embrace of family before being taken away forever. Their journeys carried loss, pressure, and quiet struggles that the public never truly saw. Now, let us lift the veil and step closer to the truth. To the real stories of the children of King Edward VII. Stories that may surprise you more than you expect. Number 6. Albert Victor. Christian Edward was born in 1864, the eldest son of Edward, Prince of Wales, and Alexandra of Denmark. From the moment he let out his first cry at Frogmore House, the entire British royal family looked at him as the one who would inherit the throne after Queen Victoria. But behind that brilliant title was a gentle, timid, deeply vulnerable soul. His mother called him by a tender nickname, Eddie, and that name held everything softest in his life. Yet this was only the first layer of pressure waiting ahead of him. At the age of 12, Eddie was sent into the Navy for training. He sat on the deck of HMS Britannia, holding the handkerchief embroidered with the letter A that his mother had given him, writing trembling letters home. These letters were later preserved, showing the shaky handwriting of a lonely child. But that was not the most challenging part. Even during training sessions, he would look toward the horizon, trying to hold on to a bit of peace he could never truly reach. In the years that followed, Eddie continued various courses and was sent to Trinity College, Cambridge, then given additional tutoring at Oxford. On winter afternoons, he would sit by the library window at Trinity, watching the last light fade over the lawn, turning the pages of books his mind could not stay focused on. Even so, amid the mounting pressures, he still found rare moments of joy. He loved riding horses with his younger brother George around the school grounds, and in those moments he felt he was not carrying the future of the empire, but simply a young man searching for peace. Yet even those small pieces of light were quickly swallowed again. He lived constantly in the shadow of an empire's expectations. His father, Edward, was strong and decisive, fully prepared to become king. Eddie was soft, academically average, unambitious, and constantly compared to a standard he could never reach. The Victorian press continually questioned whether such a prince was worthy of the crown. Once, when he left a lecture hall at Trinity, reporters were already waiting at the gate, holding newspapers with large headlines, firing questions that made him lower his head and walk away. Those scenes not only hurt him, but also became a wound that never healed. Yet that was still not what the royal family feared most. As a teenager, the media continued to dig into his supposed lack of leadership. He was quiet in class, easily lost, easily overwhelmed, and never truly believed in his own worth. It was a loneliness invisible to others, yet present in every gesture, in every glance of the young prince. In 1889, a heavier blow arrived. The name Eddie was suddenly pulled into the Cleveland Street scandal, an event that shook London. There was no evidence against him, but the public would not let him go. Newspapers exploited the story relentlessly, further damaging his already fragile reputation. People said he was so gentle that he could not withstand the weight of public scrutiny, and they were right. Afterwards, he tried to find peace through long walks around Sandringham, but loneliness followed quietly behind him. What happened next would break everything completely. At 27, for the first time in his life, a true light appeared. He became engaged to Princess Mary of Teck, a woman who was intelligent, calm, and beloved by the entire royal family. Mary brought Eddie a peace he had never known. They exchanged tender letters and began planning a life entirely different from the pressures they had always carried. But they did not know that the happiness they had just touched was already slipping away. At the end of 1891, influenza swept across Britain. Eddie fell ill in early January. His room at Sandringham was filled with the chill of winter. Queen Alexandra sat by his bed, holding the hand of her eldest son, trying to keep warmth in fingers that were growing cold. Princess Mary stood at the foot of the bed, eyes red, her engagement ring still on her hand. Behind the half-closed door, the doctor simply shook his head. Mary then placed the ring on the table and cried quietly. On January 14th, 1892, Eddie took his final breaths. He was only 28. A witness recorded his last words to his mother. "It will not be long now, Mama." In that moment, the future of the royal family turned completely. The one destined to inherit the throne was no longer Eddie, but his younger brother George. The marriage intended for Eddie passed to his brother, and from that union came the line of King George V, King George VI, and Queen Elizabeth II. Eddie's funeral cast a pale grief over Britain. His flag-covered coffin was carried across the grounds of Sandringham, where the wind moved softly through the trees as though nature itself had fallen silent. Queen Alexandra nearly collapsed, and his father, Edward, carried a deep sorrow, having once placed immense hopes on his eldest son. Princess Mary stood quietly beside the coffin, holding the ring she never had the chance to give. It was the end of a short, gentle life filled with unspoken sadness. However, his passing opened an entirely new chapter in British history. Some people are born to become legends, and some, by leaving, shape the future of an empire. Number 5. George Frederick Ernest Albert was born on June 3, 1865, the second son of Edward, Prince of Wales, and Alexandra of Denmark. In his early years at Sandringham, his mother would often lean down and softly call him Georgie, a sound warm enough to soften even the cold winds of eastern England. But from childhood, George understood one thing. He was not the chosen child. He did not carry the expectation of succession like his brother, Albert Victor. And that feeling of standing behind became the first quiet wound of his life. A small cut that would follow him forever. Time passed. George grew up beside his brother like two inseparable shadows. They shared a room, shared a schedule, and traveled together from Sandringham to Marlborough House. But at the age of 12, George was sent into the Navy. Not by his own wish, but by royal discipline. On the deck of HMS Britannia, the boy looked out over the endless sea, knowing that from that moment on, his world would be bells, rigid hours, and duties he never chose. And that was only the beginning. His years in the Navy shaped him. He became calmer, more disciplined, more principled. On long voyages, George wrote letters to his mother almost every week. A habit he carried through his youth, like a single thread that kept his quiet heart connected to home. But even the sea could not protect him forever. One winter letter from Sandringham in 1892 shattered everything he knew about his future. His brother, Albert Victor, had died at the age of 28. George stood frozen in a corridor, the letter falling from his hand. In that instant, he lost the person closest to him. And he also lost the safety of being the one in the lead. In a single afternoon, he was pushed into a role his entire childhood had never prepared him for. Heir to the throne. And this was only the start of storms ahead. George returned to London for the mourning. When the coffin arrived, he removed his naval cap and bowed his head for a long time. From that moment, he knew his life had turned to a new page. A page he never chose. But he continued on that path without complaint, without resistance. For his family. For his country. And for the brother he had always loved. A few months later, George married Mary of Teck, who had once been engaged to his brother. But their marriage was not cold or forced. Mary saw in George a steadiness few possessed, and George found in her someone who could share the weight of duty with him. Their relationship did not blaze with fire. It glowed quietly, intensely, like warm lamplight in the old rooms of Buckingham. However, the most significant challenges were still to come. In 1910, upon the death of Edward VII, George became King George V. 4 years later, Europe descended into the First World War. Britain faced decisions of life and death. And George, with the discipline shaped by the Navy, led his nation with such caution and patience that historians agree, had he not been the king, Britain might have taken a different path. During the war, he made one of the most symbolic decisions of the century. He changed the royal family's name from Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, with its German sound, to Windsor. It was more than an administrative act. It was a declaration of spirit, a promise that the king stood with his people in their darkest days. And from that moment, the House of Windsor began. Time moved on. After the war, another storm rose, this time from within the family. George's relationship with his eldest son Edward grew increasingly strained. George wanted a serious heir, one who was responsible. Edward was drawn to pleasures, romances, and a lifestyle that caused deep worry. The distance between father and son became a quiet, persistent ache that George carried until his final days. As old age came, his health declined. He suffered from bronchitis and chronic lung disease, yet he continued to appear in public. He continued to read the Christmas radio message each year, a tradition he had begun. Those moments allowed the entire nation to hear the slow, steady, responsible voice of a king who had spent his life holding his country upright. One winter night in 1936, George lay in his sickbed while Mary held his hand. Softly. Gently. The way his mother once whispered, "Georgie." He took his final breath at the age of 70, closing a reign now seen as one of the pillars of a turbulent century. But his legacy did not lie in the portraits at Westminster. It lived in the name Windsor, in the image of a king who always appeared when his nation needed him, and in a monarchy that stepped into the modern age with the discipline, stability, and devotion George carried all his life. This is the story of a man who never sought the crown, yet wore it with every ounce of responsibility he had. A man without natural brilliance, yet one whose legacy runs deeper than any light shining on a throne. Number 4. Louise Victoria. Alexandra Dagmar was born on February 20th, 1867, the first daughter of Edward VII. From her earliest years, she was different from what people imagined a royal princess to be. Not loud, not seeking attention. Louise grew up quiet, shy, and reserved. Her mother protected her so closely that sometimes she longed for just a little freedom of her own. A small breath of space within a royal world that felt too tight and too bright. But even such simple wishes were never easy to have. Her parents were symbols of the Victorian and Edwardian era, and every member of the family lived under the strict gaze of the public. Louise grew up in that shadow. A mother celebrated for her beauty. A father at the center of an empire. And she, with her introverted nature, often felt herself stepping one pace behind. Not because she lacked anything, but because she had never wanted to stand in the center as so many palace-born children were expected to. Time moved on, and Louise's life shifted when she married Alexander Duff, a Scottish nobleman, in 1889. The marriage faced quiet resistance within the royal family. A senior princess had never married outside royalty before. But Louise followed her heart. And it became the most important decision of her life. Yet fate did not allow her to keep that happiness for long. In 1890, her first son was born and passed away within hours. No historical record provides a detailed description of the moment. But the grief of a mother losing her child does not need documentation to be understood. Louise carried that loss in silence, without shedding tears before the public, without letting anyone see her break down. It was the first tragedy to touch her life, and a wound that would follow her for many years. However, her story did not end with one loss. In 1893, while traveling to Egypt, the ship carrying her family was involved in an accident off the coast of Scotland. It was a serious event that nearly caused the vessel to sink. Louise, who had already endured the pain of losing a child, once again stood at the boundary between life and death. From then on, she became more cautious, more withdrawn, and more aware of life's fragility. In the years that followed, Louise devoted herself to her two daughters, Alexandra and Maud. She stayed away from the spotlight, avoided lavish events, and chose a simpler life than many other royals. Yet even when she did not seek attention, royal duties still followed her. Louise always had to appear proper. Always had to uphold the image of a princess royal. Always had to walk within the mold created for those of royal blood. In 1912, the greatest tragedy of her life came once more. Alexander Duff died. His death took away not only the man she loved, but the anchor that helped her balance her private life with her royal duties. From that moment, she became a widow and lived more quietly than ever. No scandals. No conflicts. No noise. Only a quiet woman moving through her remaining years with dignity. After her husband's passing, the fief title was passed down through the female line under a special provision, a rare event in British royal history. Her two daughters became symbols of a unique lineage, part of a legacy she never displayed but quietly preserved. In her final years, Louise continued to attend critical royal events, not radiant, not seeking attention, but always carrying a calm, composed presence that was uniquely hers. She died on January 4, 1931, at the age of 63. Her passing was quiet, just as her life had been, unadorned yet deeply felt. And in the end, Louise left behind a legacy not born from power or brilliance, but from calm, endurance, and dignity in all circumstances. A princess who did not choose the spotlight. A mother who carried the pain of losing a child. A wife who survived widowhood. A royal woman who left her mark in her own quiet, humane, and quietly strong way. Number 3. Victoria Alexandra. Olga Mary was born on July 6, 1868, the fourth child and second daughter of Edward VII. From the earliest years of her life, her days no longer truly belonged to her. Alexandra, her mother, who was famous throughout Europe, struggled with long-lasting health problems and quickly became dependent on the shy daughter who stayed by her side. That was only the beginning of a journey unlike anyone else's in the family. Her mother called her Toria, a soft and intimate name, the name of a daughter who was always close. Walks in the garden. Quiet moments beside the dogs were Alexandra's favorite. Those simple things created a bond so strong that Victoria could hardly tell where affection ended and responsibility began. And as she grew older, that peaceful closeness slowly became a gentle confinement. The shadow of her parents' fame was always there. Edward VII stood at the center of European royal life. Alexandra was a national symbol of beauty and elegance. Growing up between two icons meant Victoria never had a normal childhood. Every gesture, every step, lived under the eyes of others. Even when she did not seek attention, it still found her. While her siblings moved forward into their own lives, Victoria stepped back. She was always by her mother's side in nearly every event. Her shyness made her retreat even further. And just when it seemed she had grown used to that rhythm, the invisible ties around her tightened with each passing year. Time went on. As Victoria grew into adulthood, Alexandra increasingly relied on her. Many accounts say she hardly wanted her daughter to leave her side. And that was when Victoria faced the most critical decision of her life: to build a life of her own or stay and care for her mother. Victoria chose to stay, a gentle choice with enormous weight. It opened up decades of living entirely according to Alexandra's needs, from home lessons to public duties whenever her mother was unable to appear. In 1910, King Edward VII died. The atmosphere in the family changed. During the funeral, Victoria walked beside her mother, slowly and silently. From that moment on, Alexandra relied on her more heavily than ever. Victoria's days became long corridors, quiet rooms, and constant attendance at her mother's side as Alexandra grew weaker. Those years felt like a loop with no end. Then fate moved again. In 1925, Alexandra died. The person Victoria had spent her entire life beside was suddenly gone. The loss left a void so profound that Victoria faced a question she had never considered. How do you live when the person your whole life has revolved around is no longer here? After decades of care, she entered the loneliest chapter of her life. Many sources describe her living quietly in Ivor, Buckinghamshire. No duties, no roles, no one who needed her anymore. She spent her days with her pets and the familiar paths of the silent grounds, small anchors that still tied her gently to the world. And the silence continued until the end of her life. Victoria died on December 3, 1935, at the age of 67. She passed as quietly as she had lived. No display, no search for royal spotlight, only a life walked with devotion. And in the end, what she left behind was not glory or power. It was the image of a princess who devoted nearly her entire life to her family. A daughter who lived for her mother. A woman who sacrificed far more than she ever received. A royal figure remembered in a way that is quiet, but deeply felt. Number 2. Maud Charlotte. Mary Victoria was born on November 26, 1869. From the earliest years of her life, she carried something few people knew. Although she was the most lively and playful child in the family, Maud was also the one who had to leave home the earliest. That separation later became a pain that stayed with her throughout her life. Within the family, Maud was called Harry, a mischievous-sounding nickname that felt completely different from the image of a royal princess. She loved riding horses, cycling, and playing with the family's beloved dogs. But even that small sense of freedom could not escape the shadow of the fame surrounding Edward VII and Alexandra, two figures admired across Europe. As she grew older, Maud came to understand more clearly that her liveliness always stood in contrast to the too perfect image of her mother. Time passed. Maud's independent nature became increasingly evident. She was not like Louise, who was calm, nor like Victoria, who was shy. Maud needed space. She needed movement. She needed the feeling of living true to herself. However, life within the royal family meant that every step she took was confined to a fixed framework. And then a quiet shift appeared. Expectations of a royal marriage began to weigh more heavily on her. In 1896, Maud married Prince Karl of Denmark. It was the moment that opened a new path, a path no one else in her family had ever walked. But the most unexpected event came in 1905, when Karl was chosen to become the king of an independent Norway. With one decision in history, Maud, the youngest daughter of Edward VII, became the first Queen of Norway, a newly independent nation. But behind the bright light of the throne was a very real wound. Alexandra, Maud's mother, who was deeply attached to her youngest daughter, was heartbroken when Maud left England. Records show she did not want her daughter to go far. She did not want Maud to live in a foreign land with harsh weather and an unfamiliar culture. And Maud, even while stepping into her role as queen, carried a homesickness that seeped into every year of her life. Many times she returned to England just to be near her mother, as though trying to mend the quiet gap between them. As Queen of Norway, Maud did not seek glory. She lived a quiet life, focusing on charitable work for women and children. The Norwegian people loved her for her simplicity, her minimalist style, and her gentle, steady presence. But behind the public smiles, Maud remained the English princess who missed her homeland and the days of freedom with her family. Then tragedy came again, not loudly, but enough to slow the rhythm of her life. Maud's health gradually deteriorated in her later years. She returned to London for treatment, returning to the very place she had once left to step into her role as queen. On November 20th, 1938, Maud died due to complications after surgery. A life that closed in a full circle. A woman who lived between two homelands passed away in the land where she was born. Maud's passing brought grief to both England and Norway. The English remembered the lively, independent princess. The Norwegians remembered the gentle, kind, and approachable queen. Her only son, Prince Alexander, later King Olav V, became one of the most important leaders of 20th century Norway. The legacy Maud left behind was not political power or grand declarations. It came from her soft but steady integration, her dedication to her role as queen, her devotion to her family, even while living far away. And above all, the image of a woman who kept an English heart but chose to walk with Norway during some of its most important years. And that was Maud's unique color, utterly different from the fragile Albert Victor, the steadfast George V, the reserved Louise, or the devoted Victoria. Maud was the breath of freedom within the royal family. She was the bridge between two nations, and she was a quiet but deep mark on the map of European history. Number 1. Alexander John Charles Albert was born at Sandringham House on April 6, 1871. As the sixth child, he came into the world in the quiet expectations of a royal family that was already large. But from the very first hours, everything was different. He was born prematurely, very weak, and described as delicate in the few surviving records. Alexandra, his mother, known for her gentleness, stayed beside the small cradle where her youngest son was fighting for every breath. His entire world existed inside the silent room at Sandringham, the only place where he lived his brief 24 hours. On April 7, 1871, Alexander John died in the arms of his family. No childhood. No moments of growing up. Only the heavy silence that settled over Sandringham after he was gone. The funeral was held quietly within the estate, in accordance with the family's wish for privacy. Alexandra was deeply affected by the loss, and records say she remained beside his cradle until his final moments. Alexander John left no legacy in the traditional sense. However, in royal history, he remains a poignant full stop, a poignant reminder of the fragility of a life that never had the chance to unfold. Thank you for staying until the end of this journey. Each child of Edward VII that we have explored carries a unique fragment of royal history. Some lived fragile lives. Some were bound tightly by duty. And some spent their entire lives far away from the home they loved. Together, they form a portrait that is deeper and more human than what the outside world often sees. Behind the palace doors, there are still many stories lying quietly in the shadows, waiting to be told with honesty and respect. If you want to continue discovering that world where every child carries a different emotional note and where history unfolds with warmth and humanity, please subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the journeys ahead. And if these stories have touched you, helped you understand more, or changed the way you see those born under the gaze of an entire empire, please like the video. It is the simplest way to help these quiet stories continue to be shared.